Farmers today are facing rising costs, volatile markets, and extreme weather. The A Better Way to Farm podcast digs into strategies to help you take control of farm inputs and maximize profit so your farm can thrive for generations. Remember to take advantage of our free resources at abetterwaytofarm.com. Now, from America's Heartland, here's your host.
Hey guys, Rod here at A Better Way to Farm. Welcome to day 5. Today we're going to talk about calcium. I hope you're having a good holiday season. And as we launch off into the 12 days of nutrients here, that we're keeping the main thing. I did some more additional research, went to some other sources, actually went on the internet to look for some stuff today. And one of the things that I came across was something from the Fertilizer Institute, and it was under the title of essential elements. They're talking about calcium. Calcium is classified as a secondary nutrient that is needed in relatively large amounts by plants in the form of Ca+2. This is interesting. In some species, the requirement for calcium is actually greater than it is for the macronutrient phosphorus. Isn't that interesting that sometimes we have plants that need more calcium than they do phosphorus? They have a chart. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just 3 crops in particular that jumped out at me. Alfalfa, to get 8 tons to the acre, needs to uptake 175 pounds of calcium. Corn, to make 200 bushel, has to uptake 49 pounds of calcium. And soybeans, to make only a 60 bushel yield, have to uptake 26 pounds of calcium. They feel that calcium deficiencies are not common in most crops, but may occur in acidic soils. We would actually go through some of our other resources here, and we find calcium deficiencies in all kinds of soils. And the fact that our pH is great does not necessarily mean that we are off the hook. Doesn't mean necessarily that we are going to have adequate calcium in that plant. We'll talk more about that. Typically, your deficiencies are going to show up in your young expanding leaves. And here's an interesting deficiency sign. You may have abnormally dark green foliage. We associate that with great nitrogen levels, right? And there might be a correlation there between having a super dark green plant and maybe a little too much nitrogen and not enough calcium. Calcium also results in weakened stems, and so we don't want those plants to fall down, to lodge, and so we've got to figure out how it is that we're going to avoid that. And having the adequate calcium in there is really your friend. Another source that I found was talking about the fact that it is an essential secondary nutrient, for particularly in corn, and that's what this article was all about. And here's some of the things that it does. Cell structure. It helps form pectin, which is a key component of cell walls. So we don't want those cell walls to rupture. We need adequate pectin, which comes from calcium. That gives our corn plants their rigidity so they'll stand. And this is really important during the reproductive stages when the kernels are developing also. It's responsible for cell division. It activates the enzymes that help the cells divide and elongate. It regulates the uptake and metabolism of nitrate, which is essential for ear kernel development. Calcium helps maintain cell wall membrane stability, which helps your corn withstand stress. Calcium also helps prevent clay dispersion, which can improve water percolation and reduce runoff. It also helps to maintain that favorable pH that we want to talk about. And calcium really helps with disease resistance. It improves that plant's resistance to all the different pathogens that are out there. What are we looking for in corn? What do the symptoms look like? Reduced root systems. A lot of times the roots will be dark brown. And we have a chlorosis that will show up in young leaves. When we were working in the seed corn business, we found it interesting that where we had a calcium deficiency, we called them whips. That whorl would not open up, and there'd just be a whole bunch of leaves all bound together, tightly wrapped. And that calcium deficiency was invariably creating problems in the development of that corn plant. And so those are some of the things that we want to look at. As we start talking about calcium, see, oftentimes we use calcium and pH interchangeably, and those are not the same. Yes, calcium impacts pH, so does magnesium. Actually, as I understand it, magnesium actually raises pH twice as fast as calcium does. And so therefore, if we have a high mag soil, and we're trying to drive that mag off that soil colloid, it's going to take a significant amount of calcium to do that because we've got to replace the mag with that. Obviously, sulfur is our helper too, but putting on a lot of calcium, people, well, my pH will get too high. Well, probably not, because every time you drop off 1 pound of magnesium, it creates the room in that spectrum for 2 pounds of calcium. And so we're not really too worried about that. And I do, guys, calcium amounts, availability is important. pH is important. They are not interchangeable. Let's talk pH for a minute, though. We know that 7 is neutral. And sometimes in the industry, we tend to say, well, you know, it was at 7, was at 6.8, now it's down to 6. That's no big deal. And then, well, it just moved from 6 to 5, and then it got down to 4.8. Guys, this is huge. And here's what we need to understand. It's powers of hydrogen, okay? What that means is if 7 is neutral and we go to 6, it's 1 time more acidic. But when we move to 5, we have now become 10 times more acidic. And if we happen to go to 4, we are 100 times more acidic than we are at 7. Going on the other side, going to the getting alkaline, high pH. Moving to 8, 1 time more alkaline. Moving to 9, 10 times more alkaline. Moving to 10, 100 times more alkaline. That's why adjusting the pH of your spray water is so important. Just suffice it to say that it's powers of hydrogen, and they really get us. Of course, my first resource I like to go to is the Agronomy Handbook from Midwest Labs, and I encourage all of you to get one of these. On page 48, they do give a good intro to calcium. They say that the total calcium in soils ranges from anywhere of 0.1% up to 25% calcium. The calcareous soils in the arid west have the highest levels, and the acid soils in the humid southeast have the lowest. However, not all of the total calcium in soils is in the form available to crops, and exchangeable calcium is generally considered to be the primary available form. This nutrient plays an important role in the fertility of soils. Some plants, such as alfalfa, clover, and certain leafy vegetables, require large amounts of calcium. Plants of these type thrive best when the predominant base in the soil is calcium. It is associated with the development of protein. It assists in root development, the movement of carbohydrates within the plant, and it is needed for cell walls, seed production, and other processes. Guys, this nutrient is really important. Yes, it's a secondary, it's not a primary, but there are certain crops in which it needs more of the crop needs more of the secondary nutrient than it does of the primary nutrient, phosphorus. Interesting. Go to the Fertilizer Handbook and go to page 94. I did this because I want to understand, I want to talk about in relationship to pH that oftentimes, guys, the quarry next to us is not the quarry that we need to get our lime from. And while we're on the subject of lime, let's talk about how finely ground it is. We need that the more finer the grind, the more available the calcium becomes, the quicker it breaks down, the quicker we get the use out of it. I see guys spreading lime and it looks like chips that we put in our barns to pack down for the cattle. And all of a sudden, that's not very available. And I don't blame the quarry. They sell rock. They want to sell rock for a living. They don't care. Lime is a byproduct, and they just need rid of it, okay? But if it doesn't go through the right screens, we need to be saying, hey, guys, this isn't the one for us. And more importantly for us here, where I live, there's a quarry about 3 miles away, and it has really high magnesium lime. And so when I put it on, man, it adjusts my pH like right now. But the problem with that is I already have too much magnesium, and I need rid of that magnesium, and I need calcitic lime. And one of the things you got to remember is, according to this, calcitic lime will typically be about 32% calcium. Dolomitic lime will be about 22% calcium, and then there'll be a bunch of magnesium in there with it. And so when we're looking for lime, some of us are going to have to go out, go through the aggravation of hauling it 40 or 45 miles to bring it in. And people say, oh, you can't afford to do that. I'm going to suggest you can't afford not to. Guys, we've seen the charts. I'm not going to put it up right now, but we've seen the charts on the availability of nutrients. And that's part of the reason that the majority of your nutrients are most available at a pH of about 6.8, somewhere in there, 6.5 to 6.8. That's what we're looking for. And so when that pH starts to get down into that low 6 or high 5s, mid 5s, the availability of our nutrients just becomes almost non-existent. And we don't want to have that. That is not going to be our friend. Of course, I like the Western Fertilizer Handbook. I had a couple of guys send me pictures. They said, is this it? Yeah, there's some other covers that are on it, but it's called the Western Fertilizer Handbook. And I like it because they do a good job of talking to us, teaching us what these deficiencies look like. And here they talk about the fact that calcium helps in the translocation of carbohydrates. Everyone agrees with that. It's essential to healthy cell walls. We know that. It's essential to the development of good root structure. We all agree on all of that. What are your symptoms? Growing point of the plant dies under severe deficiency. Margins of the leaves are affected, usually the younger ones. So those in the top, they'll have a scalloped appearance. And the foliage not so affected is usually abnormally dark green. Guys, that too dark is not our friend. There's a tendency for the plant to shed its blossoms and buds prematurely. Gee, what would that look like in a soybean crop? Like a big decreased yield. And then your stem structure is weakened. And again, that whip, those leaves that don't unfold or unroll in a corn plant. When we start looking at what Donald Schrieffer has to say about this, the main thing I wanted to, well, there's 4 or 5 things here, but number one that I really want to talk about is that he talked about the fact, and he says, we believe crop production failure is caused more because of a lack of nutrients rather than because the soil pH becomes lower. It isn't so much that just the pH is bad, but that low pH keeps the other nutrients from getting into that plant, and that relationship, guys, matters. Everything we do makes a difference. We cannot go stick our head in the sand and just ignore it and think we're going to get away with it. We're going to have to come in here and look at everything in a timely fashion. When we jump over to 186 to 187, he had some interesting things that are of great value to you guys, and I want to share those with you. He talks about the fact that, magnesium levels are low, then a magnesium or dolomitic lime should be used. If they're high, if the mag levels are high, then we want to use the calcitic. And he said, how much magnesium should soils contain? You say, why are you talking about magnesium? Because it's very tightly intertwined with calcium. As noted earlier, magnesium should be about 25% of the correct calcium levels for a given CEC. Guys, remember this, my friendly little table of ratings, or table 167, showing what do we have here in the way of calcium. Well, if we have a CEC of 10, we need to, and to be in the high range, we need about 1,300 parts per million. But if we have a CEC of 25 and we have 1,300 parts per million, we're low. And so this chart is everything to us, making sure we get this correct. And it comes back in again with that magnesium. We want to make sure that we're somewhere we'd like it to be 25% or less of that available calcium. I just think that chart is your friend. I'd encourage you to print that baby off and have it where you could lay your hands on it on a regular basis. He talks about the fact that the importance of using the CEC to determine the calcium and magnesium needs is huge. We use, for example, a 10 CEC soil sample. If we used a 5 CEC soil example, the calcium and the limestone needs would have been reduced because the pantry would be half as large or the hotel doesn't have as many rooms. And this too points out why liming by pH alone simply has very little basis for logic. It is possible to have a high sodium soil with a pH of 8.0 or above and have the calcium be low. You can have a pH of 8 and still have a calcium deficiency. And therefore we want to make sure that we're looking not only at the pH, but we're looking at the amount of available calcium and the amount that we need to have based on that CEC. Guys, there's a lot of studies in this. There's just a lot of studying to do here. I want to encourage you guys, get some of these books and start reading and figure out how it is that you can be more effective, more productive, and make more money. I get to reading this book of Neil's. I always like what Neil has to say about things and learning and what he says. And I'm going to share a story because a lot of his stuff I really like. And a good story is not a bad thing. Why? Because we tend to hang with it and it's tend to stick with us and we remember it. I related how when farmers cleared out timber in our area and planted soybeans, the first year they delivered a yield of about 50 bushels of beans. The next year it would go to 40 and the next year it would be 30, which is where they generally stayed. When analyzed for pH, phosphorus, and potassium, the audits showed nothing wrong. Dr. Albrecht knew soils. He had worked with and understood soils from all over the world, including all the basic soils of the Midwest, and he provided sensible, practical answers to my questions. He said, well, now wait a minute, you live over by the Mississippi River and you're in heavy gumbo soil, right? Yep. That is why your beans didn't get very tall. They got tall the first year because you had some free calcium. Now, when you take a regular soil test and send it in, if you only check pH, phosphate, and potassium, you will never find the problem. Actually, pH is influenced by a lot more than calcium. Heavy clay soils are high in mag, and that is keeping your pH high. If you had known to check for the various nutrients in the soil and put on limestone needed to get your calcium levels up, your beans would have gotten back to the size they were in the first place. You are losing out because calcium is what puts all the other nutrients into the plant. When we don't have enough calcium, we don't get the uptake of the other nutrients that we so much need, and that hurts us. Guys, pH is important, so is available calcium. We want to make sure that we're understanding that we're doing the right thing. Calcium serves in the growth of plants to mobilize other essential chemicals into the plant more speedily. The science of soil has done much for our better understanding of how the soil and plant roots interact to make crops grow. From better understanding, some principles have resulted in better guidance for our farm practices. Liming is one of those practices that has improved through science. We formally encourage liming as a struggle against soil acidity. It is now practiced to put calcium into the soil for nutritional services to the crop. It helps them with their synthesis of proteins and other complex compounds, making higher food values to man and to beast. Calcium is associated with the soil's microbial process that build up soil nitrogen. It is also effective in making green manure and other organic matter decay more rapidly and release their fertility for crop production. Guys, if we're having trouble recycling our stover, maybe we've got a calcium problem there we need to take a look at. Bugs in a jug has nothing to do with calcium. It has everything to do with calcium. I believe that some of these people who are wanting us to just think that the answer is in some bug in a jug, when they don't know anything about our soil and we don't know what our available calcium is, because I think some of those bugs are dead on arrival when they hit that dirt if the pH is too far out of whack. And so we need to be taking that into account. The soil treatment must, however, be judiciously connected with other treatments. It must not, therefore, be used excessively, and I'm going to talk more about that here just in a little bit. The answer is not just lay the calcium to it. It's to get on the right amount. Using too much of it will bite us just as hard or worse than not having enough. And so we want to make sure that we're doing the right things there with that. The importance of calcium for large yields. When we apply limestone and mix it with the soil, we have a mixture which is only partially ready to support a good crop. Not until the calcium and magnesium in the limestone have disintegrated and become part of the colloidal complex in the soil through base exchange reactions does the growing crop benefit from the calcium and magnesium in the limestone. If limestone is applied to the soil and the ground remains dry, the limestone remains ineffective, and if the limestone is too coarse, it may not become effective very rapidly. He also goes on to say, and this is really important, iron availability starts to decrease between a pH of 6 and 7, meaning if there's barely enough iron, we're going to get in trouble. As the calcium is raised, the iron level decreases. So some of you guys, obviously with high pHs, you fight iron chlorosis. Even those of you who are working hard to get your pH up to 6.8 need to be paying attention. We had last year a lot of people with tissue testing came back and they needed to foliar feed some iron because even though their iron levels were off the chart, they were still struggling to get adequate iron into that plant. This is really important. This may be the biggest thing I say all day. But be careful with calcium levels. The day you get calcium up to an 85% base saturation, 90% of the iron will generally be complexed and locked up just like it's in a vault. With base saturation below 80%, greater nutrient availability is the measured result. And a guy came in there and someone had convinced him, he had a consultant who had convinced him that nothing mattered. pH didn't matter. Phosphorus didn't matter, potassium didn't matter. A base saturation rate of at least 85% of calcium was all that mattered. And he'd been putting on 6 to 8 tons of lime year after year after year. And he'd taken his pH from about a 6.2 to an 8.5. And he still didn't have that base saturation rate that the consultant was looking for. And his crops had really started to plummet in yield. And I literally watched a grown man cry. And guys, here's the thing. I didn't have a great answer for him. I can tell you how to farm around it. I can tell you to apply sulfur. I can tell you to replace your nutrients. I can tell you that broadcasting nutrients, especially phosphorus, is an abject waste of money because as soon as that dry product hits the ground, the calcium ties that up and it becomes P2 and it does not become P1. And so there's a lot of things that we can do to get around it. But I don't believe that there's any one thing, guys. It's not all nitrogen. It's not all phosphorus. It's not all one anything. And it's definitely not all calcium. Is it important? Yes, it is. Would I like to see that base saturation rate around 70, 75? Yeah, at least 65. Trivia question. The world record dryland corn production still stands at 442 bushels per acre. What do you think the base saturation rate was on that farm? The answer? 52%. There's always more to it, and there's always ways to farm around it, guys. And we've got to make sure that we're doing the right things all the time. My desk pad sitting right over there says it's never wrong to do the right thing, and I just subscribe to that. And getting our base saturation too high is bad. Being too low is bad. pH too low, bad. pH too high, very inconvenient and aggravating. And working out of life and energy in agriculture, calcium determines the volume of the crop and is the major element against which all other nutrients react to release energy. It is nature's detoxifier. The reason it's overlooked centers on a lack of knowledge about pH. It is taught that soil pH is directly related to the need for liming. That is not true. And people with important sounding titles and degrees persuade farmers who do not know the technical jargon that the calcium requirements of the soil are determined by its pH. That is not it. At the lower calcium levels that we have in America today, greater amounts of acid fertilizers must be applied to achieve a given volume. The catch is that volume achieved via this practice is not synonymous with quality, as is proven by the current use of chemicals for insect and weed control. And I'll close out of the books with this, and I'm almost done, guys. If you go to page 107, just an interesting thing that he has to say. In regards to your yard, dandelions are a common weed in lawns and fields. They are a red light signal that the following sequential nutrient deficiencies exist: calcium, phosphate, vitamin A, iron. Correct those deficiencies, your dandelions will disappear. And there are a host of other weeds, guys, that likewise will disappear. Ladies and gentlemen, this is important. And doing a deeper study on this, I encourage you to dive way deeper than what I did. But suffice it to say that calcium is important. It helps all the other nutrients get into the plant. And when we get that right, we are on the road to recovery. We just thank you for your time. We hope you're finding some value in what we do. We really hope you guys are having a happy holiday season. And from all of us here at A Better Way to Farm, we hope you're having a better day.